is the day of reckoning for Paul Manafort. We can report right now that the jury is getting the official instructions from this judge, which means they are literally moments away from getting the case and deliberating on Paul Manafort's fate. A conviction on all the charges could give Trump's former campaign manager an effective life sentence. He's yet to face a trial on separate charges in Washington, nor what could come down the pike as well, with or without a pardon, which is potential state charges for related allegations like tax evasion. But what's happening now is important, and we've seen it from inside the courtroom. This is Bob Mueller's first criminal trial in this Russia probe. And the scene today was a courtroom overflowing at maximum capacity. Manafort entered the court with a small smile, we're told. His wife was sitting directly behind him in the first row. And while I will be clear, we know nothing at this moment about what this jury is thinking after all this, we do know what they're thinking about. 11 days of testimony, financial records, and evidence suggesting Manafort committed crimes for years. And here is exactly how Mueller's team closed out their argument. For jurors who might think that Manafort got kind of a rough deal by stepping into the spotlight of politics, and that's how he caught so much heat, they argued, you see it here on the screen, no person is above the law. And for anyone lost in the blizzard of accounting over these last several days, they argued that the financial crimes do boil down to a case about lies. A little bit more so you can judge it yourself. They say Mr. Manafort lied when he had money, and he lied to get more money when he didn't. They also reminded this jury about Manafort hiding his income as a loan, and, quote, poof, that magically becomes income. The prosecution then turning to Manafort's star witness, the person who worked with him so much and hurt him potentially so much, Rick Gates, caught with his hand in the cookie jar. And they told these jurors, except it wasn't a cookie jar. It was a huge dumpster of foreign money. Manafort did not take this stand, and his lawyers called 0 witnesses during the trial. Now, many experts have noted that does suggest a kind of weakness to their case, even though legally there's nothing negative to be inferred from a defendant declining to testify. The jurors heard Manafort's lawyers, though, try out a broader argument. And it's an argument that's interesting because it touches on something we all struggle with in life. What does it mean to know something? What does it mean to be certain? Well, these jurors were told by Manafort's lawyers, who didn't put on much evidence, hey, it's not enough to think someone is probably guilty or likely guilty. And as for all those debts and bills that may have looked even more than likely, well, they made a different argument and said, okay, even if that's a problem, I'm sure many of us have had some trouble paying bills. So here we are tonight, at an inflection point, on a night when Donald Trump wants people to be looking at other things and talking about other things. These jurors are going to be talking about one thing. Was Paul Manafort involved in criminal conspiracies while he was running the Trump campaign? This verdict could come as early as tomorrow morning. What happens next? What happens for Manafort and Mueller in the Russia probe? A lot of that could basically depend on what these people, these Americans who've heard all this evidence, what they decide in the coming days. I'm joined now by Elie Honig, who's a former federal prosecutor in the Southern District of New York, quite a busy place in these stories. Tim O'Brien, an executive editor of Bloomberg View, the author of Trump Nation and a former defendant in a Trump lawsuit. And Kim Whaley, who's also, of course, a former prosecutor. Elie, when you look at what happens now, based on your trial experience, what do you think is in the minds of these jurors, and how strong was the Mueller closing argument?
I think it was exactly as strong as it needed to be, Ari. This is not a case where the prosecution needed to go in there and dazzle the jury. And sometimes there are trials where you need a little bit of dazzle. The evidence was so strong, all that the prosecution needed to do was be solid and clear and credible and workmanlike. And I think they did that. And the line that really jumped out at me when I read it, I said, that's smart, is when the prosecution said the star witness in this case is the documents. And it's not it doesn't rhyme, it's not catchy, but it's such an effective summary.
Elie, if it doesn't rhyme, I'm not interested.
Some jurors may feel that way, but you know, it's boring but effective, and it gets the attention off of Rick Gates, and it gets the attention on those black and white documents that the defense cannot run from.
Well, it does go to the blizzard, though, Kim, in that we see that the Mueller team here both went in deep on all of the financial chicanery, but then pulled back in closing arguments, as we see lawyers do. And I want to read more from one of Mueller's lieutenants here, Greg Andres, who says, quote, the defense, Manafort's asking you to ignore your common sense. Manafort's told so many lies about his income, he can't keep them straight. And this one is interesting, do you really think we need more witnesses? What were they doing there?
Well, I do have something catchy for you, which is documents don't lie, they don't die, and they don't misremember. And here we've got jurors who have filled out tax returns, and they have applied for loans, or at least filled out forms, financial forms or credit cards, et cetera. And so they know that what they've done, which is say the truth, tell the truth. And we also have, 10 witnesses, IRS agent, FBI agent, former accountants, in addition to, 3 dozen emails confirming knowledge. So I think there is, a tremendous amount of evidence in favor of the government here. And to the extent to which, if we have a hung jury, which I think is unlikely, it would be for some reason other than a doubt for which there can be a reason, which is the standard that the government has to satisfy beyond a reasonable doubt.
Well, Tim, since we're all quoting, and that was about lies. There is a saying in hip-hop that also exists beyond hip-hop, that men lie, women lie, numbers don't lie. And yet Paul Manafort, if he has anything in common with Donald Trump, it's in an area that you've reported extensively on, which earned you that lawsuit, which is lying about money.
Lying about income, lying about paperwork around deals. Getting back to what Ellie said, I do think there is a very damning stream of evidence here presented to this jury. It would seem to me, as an outsider looking in, that there's zero chance of acquittal here, but there can be rogue.
But there's always more than
there could
zero.
be, and there could be a rogue juror in here. It could go either way. I think where it is now, it sort of begs the question: one, that if he does get convicted, and why did Manafort's attorneys go to the line on this one, and why didn't he plead out earlier? And I think, again, raw speculation is he's probably anticipating getting a pardon at some point. But if this goes against him, they're really going to have to rethink that whole strategy. I think the other thing to bear in mind here is there's still another trial. He has to go through another trial in Washington in September. If this one goes off the rails, do they delay that one and get this one sorted out, or do they deal with this one at a later date? I mean, there's a lot of balls in the air right now.
Well, Nellie, on the pardon, Washington Post notes Trump seems to genuinely believe, or at least claim, that the investigation is unfair. Pardoning Manafort would be a great way for him to both assert control and stick it to Mueller. And this is something that other presidents, including in the Iran-Contra matter, you saw pardons, and people felt that it was obviously looked guilty, but at that time it was lawful.
I think, Ari, if we have a conviction here, I think we're going to enter a really interesting sort of stare down between the president and Paul Manafort. Manafort's not going to just take a conviction and go die in jail. He's not that kind of person by all reporting. And so I think he's hoping for a pardon, and I think the president is hoping to prevent him from cooperating, but he needs cover if he's going to give a pardon. And those tweets that we've seen the last couple of weeks where the president's saying Manafort is being treated unfairly, I think set a little bit of a pretext to cover the president if he does decide to go the pardon route.
And on the other, he faces 30 years. Paul Manafort is going to spend the rest of his life in jail if he's convicted here. He's also going to have to think about whether or not he's going to want to cooperate if this verdict gets handed down against him.
As for the judgment that goes into this is a week where you've seen Donald Trump's judgment in hiring from Omarosa to Paul Manafort really called into question. Are these the best people? Well, even Donald Trump says no. Look at the former campaign manager, Lewandowski, talking about this very issue of, we couldn't have possibly figured this out in advance. Take a look.
Criminal? No, I didn't know. Not a criminal. There's no vetting process that I could have gone through to check Paul Manafort's financial stability. I couldn't call and say, hey, can you run a background check? It doesn't work that way.
The Trump campaign was a clown rodeo. Corey Lewandowski himself was not an ideal campaign manager. He preceded Manafort. Trump has never built strong teams because Trump lacks the discipline, patience, and sophistication to attract A-level people. And he always talks about playing three-dimensional chess. Most of the time, it's more like third graders playing bingo. And of course, they didn't vet Paul Manafort. They weren't vetting anyone. They weren't oriented towards winning the election and then putting a high-quality team in the White House. I think a lot of people hopped on the Trump campaign because they wanted to hitch their stars to his wagon, and they ended up with a lot of people who were either incompetent or had bad motives.
Kim, when you look at this kind of case, what would you expect in the timeline of this jury to make a decision?
Well, I think it should be swift. If it's not swift, then I think that's really going to be a concern for the government. But I want to make one comment.
You're saying, just to get that point, and then you go ahead.
Yeah, go
You're
ahead.
saying that the longer they're deliberating, the worse that is for Mueller, because it suggests a holdout in what otherwise could be a, quote, slam dunk case.
Correct. Right. I mean, they're going to have the document. Sounds like the instructions were read verbally, which is unusual. And the instructions set forth what the government has to prove, and normally the jury would go through each element and compare. So that might take them some time. But with this kind of evidence, it seems like it should go swiftly. But what I wanted to say about the pardon is that, it's a little unclear. Even if Trump were to pardon him here after a conviction, that would not necessarily mean that Mueller couldn't still subpoena him before the grand jury for information about the Russia investigation. And then the question would be, if he pleads the fifth, then what? Does Trump pardon him with respect to his testimony related to the Russia investigation? Because remember, that's really what Mueller wants here. And so in a way, so long as Manafort doesn't talk, Trump is kind of winning in that regard, in that they still don't have Manafort's testimony relating to the broader question of Russian collusion. They have Gates, but they don't have Manafort.
And I trust that you're using Trump is winning loosely when you consider that his campaign chair is on trial, that his former national security advisor pled guilty, that his deputy campaign manager pled guilty, that several of his other aides have pled guilty. It's a loose form of winning.
Yeah, well, I'm talking more about the broader political, it's not even political, it's really a constitutional battle between the president who's calling this a witch hunt, who's attacking the Justice Department, who's claiming that the prosecutors have no integrity, that the FBI is corrupt. That broader question, I think, is really the bigger thing that's at stake here.
I was just being dry.
Yeah, well, we're in a jovial mood tonight, so that makes sense.
Anytime. We can mix the serious with the wider lens here. At least we try to. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.